I want to welcome everybody to tonight's Ag in the Evening program. For those who don't know me, my name is Dr. Jason Banta. I'm the Extension Beef Cattle Specialist stationed at Overton. The topic for tonight is body condition scoring, and we'll also talk about some basic reproduction things with cattle, and especially how reproduction and body condition score interact. I will tell you, body condition scoring may seem like a pretty straightforward deal, but there can be a tremendous amount of variation that I see, especially from people who are a little less experienced. So hopefully tonight will help get everybody on the same page so that we can do a better job of evaluating how those cows are doing and developing appropriate management strategies. So the first thing is when I think about body condition score, we need to talk about some terminology and what terms we use when. So if we're talking about growing cattle, whether that be some stocker steers or stocker heifers out on pasture, like these stockers out on wheat pasture in Amarillo, or that be some replacement heifers we have out grazing, or cattle in a feedlot. Anytime we're dealing with growing cattle, we're going to talk about average daily gain. So how many pounds per day are those animals gaining? When we talk about breeding animals, so those animals typically, two or older, whether they be cows or bulls, we're going to talk about body condition score. And remember, body condition score is just a numerical system to talk about how fat or how thin animals are, and it'll range from a 1 to 9. So that's where we'll use those various terms is body condition scoring for the breeding animals and typically average daily gain for the growing animals. So why is body condition score important? Well, from a cow-calf standpoint, it's typically going to be the number one thing that's going to affect reproductive performance in those animals, assuming we don't have some kind of a major disease issue. So when we think about those cows having a calf and then coming back into heat to get rebred so that we have those high pregnancy rates, that's going to be driven by body condition score. Also, when we think about those cows getting bred early in the season and then calving in the early in the calving season, that's going to be driven by body condition score. Understanding what body condition score cows are in impacts our supplementation strategies. Are those cows a little on the thin side, so we need to feed them a little bit more? Are those cows in really good shape? And even if our hay quality is a little low, can we use some of those extra energy reserves in that really good body condition score to replace some of that supplementation there? While we may not be thinking about it right now, when we are in the winter or going into the winter, is those cows in better body condition score are much better able, to handle cold stress than those animals that are on the thinner side. And then there's also a correlation between body condition score and weaning weight. So those thin cows typically will not milk as much, and so they're going to wean a calf that's a little bit lighter. So body condition score has a huge impact on a lot of different areas when it comes to a cow-calf operation. When we think about evaluating body condition score on an animal, there's several places we'll look. We may not look at every place on every animal, but there are going to be several different spots. So one of them is going to be down here in the brisket, and that's typically going to be on those higher body condition scores of those fatter animals, and I'll show you some pictures here in a minute. We'll look over the ribs. We'll look down the backbone, or what we call the spinous processes. We'll look at the hook bone, or some people may call that the hip bone. We'll look at the pin bone, and then we'll look at fat bones on each side of the tail head here. So we'll look at those various areas to help give us an idea of cow body condition score. Especially when we're talking about cows that are body condition score 4 or less, one place we'll really kind of focus in on is the transverse spinous process, which is right here in front of the hook bones, is where you'll see that area, and you can see it enlarged here. So if you think about taking and cutting that animal in half, all right, what you see on top here is going to be the spinous process. The long bone that's coming out right here is the transverse spinous process. If you think about what steak we would get from that area, that's where we would get T-bone steaks. So if you look and you can count each one of those bones where that T-bone would be coming from, that tells you those cows are too thin in that situation. This is kind of another way to look at that, but at the opposite view. And so if you look here, we would have the loin eye, or some people refer to that as the rib eye. It kind of depends on how close to the head or how close to the tail you are, whether you're going to call it a rib eye or the loin eye there. This is the spinous process, or the backbone I was talking about. You can see the transverse spinous process coming out here. You can see the hide, and then you can see some fat cover over that loin eye or ribeye muscle. Now, you could palpate or touch cattle to help determine body condition score, but most of the time that's not practical. So what we're going to do is just evaluate that visually by looking at those animals. Another thing to understand is the weight of the animal is going to change as body condition score changes. So let's just say we had a cow that was 1,100 pounds at a body condition score 5. To go from a body condition score 5 to a body condition score 6, she would need to gain about 91 pounds. And so at a body condition score 6, should be weighing 1,191. If she goes from a body condition score 5 to body condition score 4, she's only going to weigh about 1022, so she's lost about 78 pounds. And for different sizes of cattle, this curve's a little bit different as far as how many actual pounds between body condition score, but roughly it's about 7% of their mature weight. So if the mature weight was 1,100 pounds here, then roughly to go to that next body condition score is about 7%, or to drop down to a lower body condition score is about 7%. So when we think about body condition score, we rank those animals from a body condition score 1 to a body condition score 9. And I actually intentionally skipped over the pictures of a body condition score 1 and 2. There's just really no reason we should ever have any of those out in the industry. We should have done something long before we got to that point from a management standpoint. So we'll focus tonight on body condition scores 3 through 9. So when I look at a body condition score 3 cow, you can see the bone structure on that cow pretty well. So you can see her shoulder blade here. You can see several ribs. Typically, you can see a couple more ribs a little easier on a body condition score than you can on this cow, on a body condition score 3, I should say. But if you look at those transverse spinous processes, or where we were talking about where we got that T-bone, we can see each one of those individual transverse spinous processes there. And if you look where the big muscle of that T-bone would be, there's just really not anything there. And then you can see the backbone or the spinous processes there. That hook bone is very prominent. If you look from hooks to pins, we've lost quite a bit of muscle mass there. And then if you see that pin bone there, it's really prominent as well. So that would be an example of a body condition score 3 cow. This is a good reason why we look at multiple spots on the cow and not just one, because if we only looked at the ribs on this cow, we may think she's actually a little bit fatter than what she is. So we need to look at a couple of different spots and kind of get the overall average for that animal. Here's another example of a body condition score 3 with a less hair on her, so it's a little bit easier to see some of these indicators we're talking about. So again, shoulder blades real visible. We can see several ribs here on this cow. We look at the transverse spinous processes. It's just a thin shelf there. We don't have any muscle. That backbone's real prominent. Hook bone, pin bone's extremely prominent on this cow. And then you can see we've lost some muscle mass between hooks and pins. So 2 different examples of a body condition score 3 cow. We look at a body condition score 4, carrying a little bit more condition. And typically what we see on a body condition score 4 cow is these last 2 ribs are pretty visible. The transverse spinous processes, we can't count the individual ones, but we kind of have what I like to call a thin shelf there. So we have some muscle in between those transverse spinous processes, but we don't really have very much muscle where that loin eye would be in that situation. Again, hook bone, pin bone, very prominent. We've lost some muscle here. Shoulder blades showing up a little bit more than what we would typically see on a body condition score cow. But really look at these last couple ribs. Look from hooks to pins here. Look how prominent that pin bone is, and look at those transverse spinous processes. Now, if we look at this Hereford cow here, at first glance, she may look like she's in a little better condition than that cow we looked at on the previous slide, but she's really not. And the key is we got to make sure we look through the hair. So it's kind of hard to see the ribs on this cow, but if you, with a little experience, you can kind of see those two ribs there. A key telling feature, again, this transverse spinous process, thin shelf here. We don't have muscle where that loin-eye would be, or that big muscle or that T-bone would be. From hooks to pins, she's lost some muscle. That pin bone's very prominent. This cow's another good example to talk about. Sometimes when cattle get, have a lot of hair on them and then they get wet, they look like they've lost a lot of condition really quick. They haven't. We just have to make sure we look through that hair when we're judging them when they're dry, and then be mindful of that wet hair if they are wet when we're evaluating body condition score. So another good example of body condition score 4. If we look at a body condition score 5, this is kind of what we would consider in the middle, not too fat, not too thin. In that situation, we can't see any rips on this cow. This isn't a heavy muscled cow, but she has started to fill in that muscle where that loin-eye would be. From hooks to pins, she's filled muscle back in, but we haven't started to put on any extra fat. So good example of a body condition score 5 there. Another body condition score 5 without any Brahmin influence. Again, we can't see any ribs on that cow. From hooks to pins, she's filled back in with muscle. We don't have any fat pones, and we haven't really started putting any extra fat down here in the brisket yet either. We look at a body condition score 6 here, and so this is a replacement heifer. Body condition score works good on them just like it does on cows. Again, we can't see any ribs. It's not obvious where those transverse spinous processes would be. All that's filled back in with muscle. From hooks to pins, we filled back in with muscle. The big telltale, once we get body condition score 6 and above, is really start looking at fat pones. So if you look on this heifer here, I'm going to highlight that fat pone. And what I like to think about on a body condition score 6 is think about an orange and cutting an orange in half and putting half of that orange on each side of the tail head. That's going to be a good example of a body condition score 6. When we get to a body condition score 7, if we look at that fat pone here, so kind of think about a cantaloupe and cutting a cantaloupe in half, and on each side of the tail head, that'd be a body condition score 7. And then this cow's starting to put some more fat down here in the brisket, but the fat pone is a real telltale here. When we get to a body condition score 8, those cattle start getting a little more square in appearance. Fat tends to be a little more square looking visually. Muscle tends to be a little more rounded. If you look at the fat pone on this cow, and it's really big, I'll highlight it here. Okay. So that's the fat pone here, and you can kind of see that break where that fat's sitting on top of that muscle, especially right there in that area. So think about a watermelon being cut in half, and on each side of the tail head is a body condition score 8. If you looked over the back of this cow, she'd start to get pretty square in appearance. And then if we look down here in the brisket, we're starting to carry some extra fat in the brisket. So don't get hung up on the dewlap. Make sure you look at the fat, and what you really see is normally the brisket would kind of be right here, but you can see we have this glob of fat on the end of the brisket. It almost makes that brisket look like it's pointing down a little bit. So that would be a body condition score 8. And then this would be a body condition score 9. And this slide gets used by beef cattle specialists all across the country. It's a good example of body condition score 9, and we just don't have a lot of great pictures of those cows. But if you look at the fat here, there's fat on top of fat. So here's kind of where that fat's sitting on top of that muscle. You can see that. And really kind of think about multiple watermelons sitting on that cow. Now, some people will look at this cow and say, well, I can see ribs. What you're actually seeing is there's so much fat, is just the way that fat's laying over that rib, and then a lot of fat down here in the brisket. And cow, you can see she's getting really square in appearance, so body condition score 9. These aren't typical. The only reason we have body condition score 9s out there is because that cow hasn't calved for at least 1 year and probably more than 1 year, but most likely somebody's attached to her. And if that's the case and it's easier to keep her and keep her on the feed bill than have the argument to get rid of her, that's fine. But realize she's not productive at that point in time and she's just costing money. So that's body condition scores from 1 to 9. And as you're getting started, if you'll kind of think, is she a 5? And say she's a 5. If she's not a 5, then decide if she's less than a 5 or she's more than a 5, and kind of work your way through it that way. So when should we monitor body condition score? Really, we want to look at those cows throughout the year. Probably the most important time is going to be a couple months prior to weaning, because if those cows are getting thin, we may want to wean those calves a month or two sooner. Or if the cows are in really good shape, we may could let those calves nurse an extra month or so in that situation. You do want to try to score the same cows in the herd each time so you can see how they're changing over time. If not, what tends to happen is your eye will typically be drawn to either the thinner cows or the fatter cows in the group. So be mindful of that. And so maybe it's you score all the cows look the same, so you just pick out a couple ear tag numbers and score them. Maybe you have a cow that's real unique from a color standpoint or something, that she's different from everybody else, and you score her and one or two others. Just make sure you're scoring those same cows if you're trying to get that trend. And then a digital camera, especially cameras on cell phones, are great to really snap a few pictures and use that. And so you could do that a couple times a year and you keep that on your phone or on your computer just to see how that body condition score is changing. Or if you call me up and ask for supplementation recommendations, I may get you to take a few pictures and send them to me. So when we think about body condition score, it's not going to stay the same throughout the year. We're going to let it fluctuate a little bit. So if we think about kind of a winter calving cow that's calving sometime in January, for mature cows, we want those cows in a body condition score of 5 or better at calving. So to optimize our reproductive rates, body condition score needs to be a 5 or better at calving. That's not saying that body condition score during the breeding season isn't important, but body condition score just prior to calving is the most important as far as getting those cows back into heat and getting them rebred. So you can see here we have this cow starting above a 5. So from calving to weaning, she's typically going to gradually lose weight. All right. And I have peak lactation here. That's just when her nutrient requirements are highest, roughly about 60 days after calving. And the reason that is milk production at calving starts here. From calving to about 60 days, it's increasing. And then roughly at 60 days after calving, milk production is going to steadily decrease until those calves are weaned. So you can see weanings typically are lowest, and then we have roughly 60 to 90 days to get those cows back into shape before we go into the winter. Now notice I have a big red line here at a body condition score 4. The reason being is if those cows get below 4, it's typically too hard to get them back into condition before we go into the winter, or we have to spend way more money to get them back into condition before going into the winter than what we would like. So we are going to let that body condition score fluctuate throughout the year, but we definitely don't want to get too low. So I talked about for mature cows, and for the purpose of this discussion, I would say mature cows 4 years of age or older, we need a body condition score of 5 or better. We'll talk about younger females here in a minute, but first I'll show you some data of why that's important in a minute. One of the things when we think about how do we increase or how can we change body condition score, one of the biggest challenges when I see most of the cows are too low in body condition score, it's because the operation's overstocked. So one thing we can do is run a few less cows and get those stocking rates in a more appropriate level, and we can keep those cows in better condition throughout the year. If we have a year where we've been a little bit of dry and we don't have the grass production we normally do, we may want to look at weaning those calves a month or two sooner, just to give those cows a little more time to get back into condition. And then we could always use supplementation and increase how much we're supplementing to improve those body condition scores. Some other things to think about body condition scores is most of the cows in the herd will typically be pretty similar in body condition. So let's just say that the cows are averaging a body condition score 6. Most of the cows in the herd would either be a 5, a 6, or a 7. Okay. Or if the cows are averaging a body condition score 5, then most of the cows in the herd would be a 4, 5, or 6. We really want to pay attention to those outliers. And so, are they fatter than everybody else because they didn't raise a calf? Are they fatter than everybody else because they're not milking well? Are they on the thinner side because they're extremely heavy milking cows and really producing too much milk for our environment? Do they have some kind of health issue going on? Or are they just kind of a hard doing cow? And so, kind of note those cows. And, if you have the same cow 2 years in a row, that she's way thinner than everybody else. She just may be too hard doing or too heavy milking for your operation, or if they're way fatter than everybody else, really see what size of calf she's raising. Ideally, what we want are those cows that stay in really good condition and raise a really big calf. So I kind of got ahead of myself a little bit while ago when we were talking about body condition score and pregnancy rates. And so this is some data out of Florida. All the data, regardless of what research you want to use, will show the same pattern here. And so we see pregnancy rates on the vertical axis, and then we see body condition score going across the horizontal axis. And so these are for mature cows. So for the purpose of this discussion, we'll say 4 years of age or older. So you can see body condition score 2 cows, not very good pregnancy rates. Body condition score 3 cows at calving or just prior to calving, it's better, but still not great. Increase with the 4, increase with the 5. From a 5 to 6, we don't have a big jump there. So what that tells us, and that's what I was saying earlier, is for mature cows just prior to calving, we want them to be in at least a body condition score of 5 or better to optimize pregnancy rates. Now, if they get to a 6 or a 7 because of good grass and stuff, great. But are we going to spend extra money from a supplementation standpoint to get them there? Probably not. So mature cows, body condition score 5 or better. If we're talking about 2 and 3-year-old females, we would want them to be in a body condition score of 6 or better going into calving. So 2 and 3-year-old females, 6 or better going into calving. So that's kind of some information on body condition score. I want to take a little bit here and kind of just let you practice and see. So I'm going to put a slide up. Just think to yourself what you think that cow would be, and then we'll talk about her. So I'll give everybody just a few seconds here to look at her and come up with what you think the body condition score is of this cow. Right? And so I would call her a body condition score 4. And so if we look here, you can see the last couple ribs on this cow, her hook bone to pin bone, she's lost a little muscle, but the other thing is this pin bone's really prominent here, okay? You can see it, but the big telltale on this cow is being able to see those ribs. So that would be a body condition score 4. And don't worry if you've missed her, we got a few more to practice on here, but that is a body condition score 4. All right. So a few seconds to look at this cow. And so remember, kind of look at those ribs, look from hooks to pins. Has she lost muscle? Look on each side of the tail head. Do we have a fat pone there or not? All right. So this cow would be a body condition score 7. So if we look, we can't see any ribs from hooks to pins. She's filled back in with muscle. The real telltale here is look at this fat pone. So remember I said a fat pony, if we think about a cantaloupe being cut in half and on each side of the tail head, that would be a body condition score 7. It's a little harder to see on this cow because she's got a little more dewlap, but she's also starting to put some fat down here in that brisket. But the real easy thing to tell on this cow is the fat pone here. Now, somebody may be looking and say, well, I see a little bit of the shoulder blade. You do, and that'll happen, especially on some cows or certain breeds. That's why we got to look at multiple spots on that cow and look at some of those key indicators for each body condition score. All right. So give you a little bit of time to look at this cow. I will tell you this cow's a little harder to look at because she does have a black hair coat and she does have a little hair. And so that's why she's in the practice part of the presentation, and she wasn't in there when we were talking about body condition score earlier. You notice most of those cows I used earlier tended to be light colored from a hair standpoint or red from a hair standpoint, just because they're a little easier to look at. So I would call this cow body condition score 5. We can't see any ribs on the cow. From hooks to pins, she's filled in with muscle. Not real easy to see that pin bone, so we have a little fat covering it up, but we don't have any fat on each side of the tail head. So body condition score 5 there. All right. So see what you think about this cow. And I would call her a body condition score 6. And in fact, if you look at it, that's a little older picture. You can tell by the quality of photography here. I use this cow because she's a good example of a 6. And then also our extension unit group years ago went through a bunch of pictures and everybody had to agree on what the body condition score was, or they didn't assign it a score using a certain presentation. And everybody agreed this was a 6, and I would agree as well. If you look again, can't see any ribs, that fat pone here, kind of think about that orange on each side of the tail head there. I will warn you, this cow's a little bit tricky here. I have her in for a reason, but again, look at the things we talked about. Look at the ribs, look from hooks to pins, look, does she have any fat pones? All right, so this is a body condition score 5 cow. And the reason this cow gives a lot of people trouble is because this cow just does not have very much volume or very much belly to her. There's a reason why she's that way, but it really helps emphasize the point. We're not looking at how big the cow is or how big her belly is. We're looking how much fat or body reserves she has or how much muscle mass she's lost. So if we look at her, we can't see any ribs. From hooks to pins, we don't have any muscle loss there, but we don't have any fat pones either. So body condition score 5 cow. All right. Look at this little red cow here. I'd call her a body condition score 4. You can see the last rib or two on the cow. The hook bone and the pin bone, you can see we've lost some muscle there. And that pin bone's a little more prominent, maybe not quite as prominent as that first chocolate F1 female we looked at that was a body condition score 4. But again, we have that muscle loss there. We have those last couple ribs. We haven't completely filled that loin eye back in with muscle. So body condition score 4 there. All right. So if we look at this cow, I would call her a body condition score 8. This one you got to look a little bit closer. Let me highlight that fat pone for you here. So this is the fat pone. If you look real close right here, you can kind of see how that fat's starting to lay on top of that hindquarter muscle back there. And then if we look down here in the brisket, that brisket's starting to point down a little bit because of the fat we're getting. And that cow's starting to get a little more square in appearance. I will tell you it's a little bit easier looking at live cows out in the pasture than it is on pictures. So if this cow kind of missed her a little bit, don't worry too much. Now, if you called her a 4, then we definitely need to talk. But if you called her a 6 or a 7 or something, I can understand that. But she is definitely a body condition score 8. All right. So another example of body condition score 5 here. We can't see any ribs. We don't have any muscle loss from hooks to pins. We don't have any fat pones on that animal. And then if you look at brisket, this is a good cow. You can see here's her brisket and how it comes up. And then you can see that dewlap below the brisket, whereas those cattle that were fatter, that we had quite a bit more fat down here and made that brisket look quite a bit bigger than what it does on this female. Right? So hopefully that helped you feel a little bit more confident about body condition scores and give you some practice there. I will tell you when it comes to weight and body condition scores, there are some patterns I tend to see. Most people tend to underestimate how much their cows weigh And then from a body condition score standpoint, they tend to overestimate what body condition is. And so that's where pictures are really helpful. And I've kind of gotten a practice of when somebody's looking for some help or we're talking about cows, just snap me a few pictures and send them. I've learned that from experience. And just as in a recent example, I was visiting with the producer and I said, well, what kind of condition are the cows in? And the producer said, well, 7, 8 body condition score. And I just wasn't sure about that, especially given the time of year. So I said, well, can you snap a couple pictures and send them to me? And when I got the pictures, the cows in the pictures averaged a body condition score 4 and actually ranged from about a 3.5 to a 5. And so if I'd set up the feeding program based on a body condition score 7, we would have way underfed those cattle in the situation. So those digital pictures are real helpful. So when we think about reproduction in beef cattle, what are going to be some of our targets? And so when we think about pregnancy rates, we typically want those pregnancy rates to be 90 to 95% or better. And the way we calculate that pregnancy rate is we take the number of cows that are pregnant and divide that into the number of cows that were exposed to the bull during that 60 or 90-day breeding season. We don't ever really want to go longer than a 90-day breeding season. Some people like to go a little shorter. There's not a huge advantage to going much shorter than that either. So typically most people run a 90-day breeding season. Now, if you don't have any heifers in the mix, then typically those pregnancy rates will be a little higher. If you do have some heifers in there, especially virgin heifers as well as first calf females, then those pregnancy rates will be just a touch lower. The other number that we really want to look at, and it's probably even more important than pregnancy rate, is what we call weaned calf crop. And so what we do there is we think about how many cows did we expose to the bull, not how many that got pregnant, but how many total did we expose to the bull and how many actually weaned a calf. And so let's just say if you had 100 head cow herd, you exposed 100 head to the bull, only 85% of them, or excuse me, 85 calves were weaned. That tells me we have an 85% calf crop. And our target should be 85 or better. Really, we would like that to be 90 or better, but 85 or better would be more than acceptable there. When we look at these females, there's a female in this picture exhibiting what we call estrus. Okay, so there's estrus, which is what some people also refer to as standing heat. And then there's estrus, which is the cycle as far as how often they come into heat. So the estrus cycle on average will last about 21 days. So if those females aren't bred and they're in appropriate body condition and appropriate age, they'll come back into heat roughly every 21 days. In reality, they'll range from 18 to 24 days. And I apologize, I realize there's a typo there. It says 18 to 21, it should say 18 to 24 days. All right. So that's the estrus cycle. And then when you see them out there and that bull is breeding them or other females are riding them and they're standing still, that's called estrus or standing heat. So if we look at this picture, the only female we know for sure that's in standing heat is this brindle colored heifer right here. So she's standing still while this other heifer is riding her, all right? So that's the one we say in standing heat, she's ready to be bred. If the bull was in with these heifers, he would mount that heifer and she would stand. Now, as they're getting ready to come into standing heat or as they're going out of standing heat, animals will try to mount them, but they're not going to stand still in that situation. Now, the other thing you may see sometimes, especially if you synchronize heifers, meaning we've given them medication to try to get them all to come into heat at the same time, is you may see a situation like we have here where we know she's in standing heat. I'm going to tell you, I'm willing to bet this one's in standing heat, not because she's riding, that doesn't tell us anything. But if we had taken this picture just a few seconds sooner or a few seconds later, this heifer here likely had just mounted the one in the middle. So if that's the case, we would know this one's in standing heat, the one in the middle is in standing heat. We don't know anything about the back one. Assuming I had that picture where this third heifer was actually mounting the one in the middle. All I can tell 100% based on this picture is the brindle heifers in standing heat. All right. When we think about artificial insemination, it's important to realize we're not going to get 100% of those females bred. And so if we're checking heat and we're breeding on that, meaning we're going out there each morning and evening and seeing which of those females are in standing heat, and then we're breeding them roughly 12 hours later, a good AI technician with good semen would expect to see 70 to 75% of those females on average get bred. If we're doing what we call fixed timed AI, where they were given medication to try to get everybody to come into heat at the same time, and we bred them just at a certain time without actually going out there and visually watching who came into heat or not, then we'd expect around 50% of those females to get bred to that AI. And so you'll typically see a range of 45 to 55. It can be lower than that. It can be a little bit higher than that. And then if you're using sex semen, those pregnancy rates will be lower than what we just discussed. The other thing to keep in mind from a reproduction standpoint is gestation length will vary by breed and it will vary within breed. So if we look at Angus, on average, their gestation length will be about 279 days compared to like Brahman is 292. So a lot of times you hear people talk about, well, how long is gestation in cattle? And the first thing people say is 9 months. Well, 9 months really isn't quite right. You know, if you're going to do in months, 9.5 would be a little closer. And so people will talk about 283 to 285 days. And on average, that's a pretty good number, but realize we have variation around that number. And even with breed, we have variation. The other thing is we'll see gestation lengths vary depending on genetics and specifically birth weight genetics. So if you're breeding some heifers to some really low birth weight bulls, it's very common to see a little shorter gestation length in that situation. So we talked about Angus averaging 279. If we're using some really low birth weight Angus bulls, it wouldn't be surprising at all to see some of those calves come at 270 days or maybe even a little sooner than that in that situation. One kind of benefit of that shorter gestation length compared to breeds or genetic lines with longer gestation length is if we think about trying to maintain a 365-day calving interval, all right? So to kind of look at this, let's just say for right now, we're going to assume a 285-day gestation length. So if I want to have a calf born every 200, or excuse me, every 365 days, and my gestation length is 285 on average, that would tell me on average, I need to have those females bred back within 80 days after calving. So 285 plus 80 is 365, okay? So you can see there, if we have some cows that have shorter gestation lengths, they have a little longer period of time to get rebred and maintain that yearly calving interval, whereas those animals with longer gestation lengths over that 285 days, they have less than that 80-day window to get come into heat and get bred to maintain that yearly calving interval. The other thing is we'll see gestation length change depending on time of the year. So typically gestation length will be a little bit shorter in the fall than it is in the spring, and that has to do with temperature. And then as I mentioned, it can vary within breeds. So if we look at the figure down here in the bottom right-hand corner, this is just showing for a group of 140 Angus cows. You can see what percentage of those females had a 272 to 275 day gestation length, 276 to 278, 279 to 283, 284 to 291 there. So that's what I wanted to talk about from a body condition standpoint and some of the basics around reproduction and some of the things we look at there. Happy to answer any questions on tonight's presentation. Feel free to go ahead and put those in the chat box or go ahead and unmute and ask those questions, and I'll be happy to answer those and happy to answer questions about tonight's presentation or any other beef cattle related topic. So another question that came in that asked, am I aware of any AI computer tools that can look at a photo and estimate body condition score of a cow? I am not aware of any technology out there that's using that at this point in time. So another question that came in was what 7-way vaccine, and I'm assuming you're referring to a 7-way clostridial vaccine, is safe at any stage of pregnancy. And so when we're talking about clostridial vaccines, they're going to be all killed vaccines. And so whether we're talking about a 7-way, an 8-way, or a 9-way clostridial vaccine, they're going to be safe at any point in time. So no concerns over pregnancy. The vaccines that we do have a concern on with pregnancy would be our viral respiratory vaccines, specifically IBR and BVD, and they will come in either a killed or a modified live version. And the killed version, which would be either the triangle line of vaccines or the virus shield line of vaccines, would be safe regardless of stage of pregnancy. When we talk about the modified lives, which would be things like Vista, Bovis Shield Gold, Cattle Master, Pyramid, those you have to be careful when you use them in relation to reproduction, and if those animals have ever been vaccinated with that product before. And you really have to look at the vaccine, the label on that product, because they'll say, safe for use in pregnant cows, and they'll put a little asterisk. Make sure you read what that asterisk says. So the safe thing from a IBR and a BVD standpoint, if you're worried about pregnancy, would be our killed products, which again would be either the triangle line or the virus shield line. So hopefully that answered that question. If not, chat back in and I'll be happy to visit some more there. All right, well, I'm not seeing anything else, so we'll go ahead and wrap the meeting up. And again, everybody have a good evening and a good week.